All right, so in this video, I want to continue this discussion of what I call the liberal tradition in America, which really combines liberal political philosophy, emphasizing limited government, individual rights, an emphasis on the liberty of the individual, with a belief in economic liberty, that limited government, individual free choice, and liberty is also the best thing for the community economic strength as well. That property rights are an extension of liberal values, of uh, a strong tradition that values individual liberty, and strong property rights are the kind of thing that you need in an economy that's going to prosper for the long term. So we can see this kind of measured we can see this come together in this quote by Thomas Jefferson, obviously one of the most important founders of the country, our third president. He said, "A wise and frugal government, which shall restrain men from injuring one another, shall leave them otherwise free to regulate their own pursuits of industry and improvement, and shall not take from the mouth of labor the bread it has earned. This is the sum of good government." You can absolutely hear the resonance of Adam Smith, the idea that that the best government is the government that sort of provides a measure of peace, easy taxes, and allows people to sort of go about their business. And this is what we would call really classical liberalism. And this is what I mean when I talk about the liberal tradition and liberalism, not 21st century liberals in terms of, contemporary politics, but this deeper, larger historical tradition that is rooted in the idea that the individual is the primary focus of the rights, of rights that have to be respected by the government and by other people. So that means that individuals have the right to things like self-expression. Even if it might challenge what the government wants you to think, because you're an individual, the rights are rooted in you, not in the government in this case. So you have the right to say what you think is right. You have the right to believe and to follow your conscience in this case. So we think of things like freedom of religion, because those are rooted in individual rights to choose, your own faith tradition, rather than having to say, worship whatever the government chose for you, whatever they thought was the best religion. That would be a violation of the liberal tradition. Rather, people are free to choose for themselves. People have the right to keep what they make. If you remember, we talked about John Locke. For him, because we have the right to our own lives, we control and own ourselves. We have the right to the fruits of our labor. That the things that we make, the work that we do, is our own. And so property, Locke argued, was an extension of that fundamental right. So when we look in the American tradition at these words like life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, we can hear clear resonance with this older, but also operating at the same time and continuing afterwards, this idea of classical liberal thought, that governments ought to limit themselves to protecting those rights. And if you think back to the modules that we've had so far, talking about all the ways that our government is supposed to be limited, supposed to prevent it from doing things to individuals or to groups of people, you can kind of see that idea in actuality or in practice. Another principle of the liberal tradition that will come about a little bit later, but kind of continue this line of thought, is what we might call the harm principle. And this was something that was developed by John Stuart Mill. And he argued that governments ought not to try to control your behavior, ought not to try to tell you what to do, even if they could claim it's in your own interest, and even if it really is in your own interest. Because there's sometimes that we don't make the right decision. I know that. I don't always make the right decision for myself. I'm sure there have been times when you don't either. But the harm principle says is that people ought to be free to make mistakes. They ought to be free to do the things that they think are best, even if they really aren't the best. And that the only things that the government ought to try to stop people from doing are things that cause harm to other people. That's the harm principle. The reason for this is in part because John Stuart Mill felt that individuals are all different. There's some similarities, of course, a lot of similarities, but we have different natures. He said here that human nature is not a machine to be built after a model and set to do exactly the work prescribed for it, but a tree, which requires to grow and develop on all sides, according to the tendency of the inward forces which make it a living thing. So what is he saying? He's saying that you and I have in sort of innate essence, a nature that drives us towards certain things that want us, we want to be happy. We want certain things that we consider to be good, but we're not all the same. And to try to make a model from any central government or central authority that would try to make a model to guide us to be the same is likely to be faulty, almost assuredly, because individuals are different, and so you have to give them the space to express their difference, to choose different things, to be different types of people. Like trees, which kind of grow up out of their own essence, it's not, our lives will not become flourishing and happy from the outside, but from the freedom to kind of grow and express who we are as individuals. So the harm principle, in part, is a principle which says that you have to allow people to make their own decisions, even if you disagree with them or you think that they're not going to be in their own interest, because that really is how you allow for individual self-expression, individual flourishing, and the ability to really allow people to be great, to not be perpetual children. That according to this way of thinking, to be an adult means to be able to make your own decisions, to live by the consequences, to think for yourself, and to be responsible for the things that you do. But if the government is stepping in and making decisions for you, trying to guide you down certain paths, acting like a parent, we might call that paternalism, by passing laws and doing things that force you into certain types of behavior, that it's, in a way, even if it means to be helping you, it is preventing you from really growing to your full extent. So the liberal tradition emphasizes individual and local control over economic and moral decisions. People should be able to make their own contracts and their own moral decisions so long as they don't harm other people and they don't interfere with other people's abilities to have the same rights and freedoms. So that's a kind of the broad outline. But, what if this is not the right answer? What if this emphasis on individual freedom, individual liberty, local control leads to bad outcomes, or at least bad outcomes in certain respects? It's out of the growth of this original liberal tradition, but also a feeling amongst what we call liberals and conservatives today that in part the original vision is not completely satisfactory, that it doesn't always lead to the best outcomes, and then it might need amending in certain parts. And this is where we're going to kind of continue to talk about ideology and how it's changed and been shaped by American history. So one of the critiques of liberalism is an economic critique. And in the 19th century, especially in the late 19th century, many people felt that the laissez-faire, deregulated economy which allowed people or forced people to face the economy alone as individuals, to do the best they can, to make their own way. Many people felt that this was leading to a very bad situation for many, maybe even most people. Now, you could argue that the reason that people were having a tough time was their own fault, or you could argue that the system was being rigged against them. But many people found in the 19th century a state of great inequality in wealth, in income, in prosperity, and in really future potential for happiness because of the kinds of economic arrangements which had arisen under the laissez-faire system. So many people felt that while in theory allowing everyone to face the market as individuals might make some sense, it led to a stark division between the strong, the powerful, and the weak. That some had done very, very well in that system as individuals. You might think of bankers and industrialists, the very most prosperous, that they had learned how to operate in the free market very, very successfully. But others had found that the market had not benefited them, but in fact had left them feeling powerless, destitute, and helpless. And so a number of figures began to argue that the government ought to step in certain situations, even though that might be a violation of this idea of laissez-faire, that in certain situations this would be necessary because powerful interests had grown up in this unregulated economy that now represented a threat to the economic chances of ordinary people. So a man like William Jennings Bryan, who led a populist kind of revolt against what he considered to be the forces which had grown up and to the detriment of ordinary Americans. People like coastal elites, wealthy folks in big cities on the East Coast. These folks were using the system to disadvantage and oppress farmers through debt and things like that. So he argued, for example, that the government ought to lower the debt burden by, for example, using silver along with gold to pay for dollars, to pay for money, that this would have the effect of raising the amount of money in circulation by expanding the things that could back money. And this might sound like a little bit of an odd argument today. We don't have metal backing to our money, but it used to be the case that money was backed by gold. The populists argued that that was really restrictive. It kept money hard to find and hard to get. It made the value of money very, very high. But it meant that anyone who was in debt had a hard time paying back the debt. So things like the free silver movement, which would increase the amount of greenbacks, the amount of dollars in circulation, would help to alleviate the ordinary people. Bryan argued also that the government ought to nationalize certain important industries like railroads and telegraphs, which were used, he argued, to exploit farmers who had to pay very, very high fees to have their goods traveled along railroads or telegraphs, which were controlled by powerful interests. They argued for a progressive income tax, which is something we have today. Bryan eventually would become the Democratic nominee for president several times, and the Bryan agenda would become part of the way that the Democratic Party in the late 19th and early 20th century would argue for. We kind of hear some of this resonance today. Things like the progressive income tax. Those who had been most successful would face a higher marginal income tax rate than those who had not made as much money. They argued for increases in democracy. So this was a limitation. They considered this to be one of the original limitations in the Constitution was the fact that it had too many limitations on the power of majorities to have their decisions put into place. We talked about this earlier. The Constitution is not fully democratic. It has certain elements that limit the power of majorities to have their will enforced. And so the Democratic Party and William Jennings Bryan thought that this was allowing for elite figures to thwart the will of the people, the popular majority. So things like direct election of senators, which now we have, would help to make the system more democratic. And inflation, which I've kind of talked about in regards to free silver, but that inflation could be beneficial for those who had a lot of debt and they needed higher incomes and they needed it to be easier to pay off this debt. But this would be something that was very much opposed by people who had lots of credit, who had lots of money saved up, who were bankers and who were owed the money and who didn't want to see the value of that money eaten away by inflation. So some argued that the neutral, quote unquote, neutral laissez-faire system was not really neutral, that it benefited some people at the expense of others, and that the populists argued that the government could usefully intervene in the economy to help those who were weak. So this would represent maybe a violation in a certain way of the laissez-faire system, but they argued that this would be beneficial, and so it was a justified interference. Another type of twist on the economic liberal tradition is in the form of progressivism. Progressivism focused less on the farms, the countryside, less on the things that the populists had worried about, and more about what they saw as the failure of laissez-faire economic liberalism to bring prosperity to urban areas, to cities, to ordinary people who lived in the cities. And the progressive movement had in some ways a similar critique to the populists, but their argument for fixing things would be a little bit different, and we will talk about that in the next video.